Okay, have you guys had a chance to take a look at the video for chapter 5? It is uploaded in Blackboard. It does sort of like provide you with a lengthy discussions about materials from chapter 5. We have pretty much covered everything from chapter 5, but what the video lecture does in addition to what we covered in the class is that it talks about some in-class problems from the lecture. So take a look at that. It also talks about this other theory called the liquidity preference theory. I am just skipping those because I think the video is sufficiently rich. So if you just watch the video, you should have a good idea about the materials. I will consider the materials that I covered in my video lecture to be valid, to be fair, to ask them in the question, in the exam. So the video lecture is very important. So please take a look at that. Today what we're going to do, we're going to move to the next chapter, which is chapter number 6. So before we leave chapter 5 is basically designed to give you an idea about how the price of a bond and the interest rate of a bond is determined and their apparent relationship between each other. So we have developed this demand-supply framework where the price of a bond is basically determined through the interaction of the demand and the supply side. And then we argued that the price of a bond is negatively related to the interest rate earned on that bond. So the interest rate and the price of a bond are negatively related. Today what we're going to do, we're going to start chapter 6, where in chapter 6 we are going to spend our time trying to understand about two very important and related concepts. We are going to today look at this idea of risk and term structure of interest rates. Okay, the basic idea behind what we are going to cover today is that the interest rate can be affected by the risk of the assets. It can also be affected by the term or the maturity date of the assets. Something that we have looked before, but today we are going to, in this chapter, we are going to take a more formal approach by invoking four sort of related theories that explains how the term structure of interest rates are determined. So what it is basically is going to talk about is that why do bonds of different maturity rate have different interest rates? Why is the long-term, why is the interest rate or the return on long-term bonds different from return on short-run bonds? And we are, in that discussion, we are going to talk about the role of risk. We are going to talk about the role of the maturity date. So this is an interesting chapter, and I think it's a fairly sophisticated, approach that Mishkin has undertaken. So what we are going to look at is that bonds with the same maturity, meaning that they are all going to mature in within the same time constraint, can actually have different interest rate due to the perceived default risk of those bonds, the liquidity feature of those bonds, and tax considerations on those bonds. So three factors, all of them are important for your exam. Sometimes can help us to explain why financial assets with similar kind of maturity date has fundamentally different kind of interest rate. The first one that we always start with is this idea of a default risk. Can anyone give me an idea about what do you think about what default risk is? Anyone? What is a default risk? Yeah.
The risk that the company or whoever's paying the coupon payments and everything goes bankrupt, can't make the payments.
Okay, so that's obviously a financial definition. That's a very good one. We want to look at the same idea. We want to broaden that idea because when we think about default risk, we are not only thinking about a stock or a bond, but any kind of financial assets. So remember from our previous discussions, we have learned that there are two kinds of return that you get from buying a financial asset, right? First of all, it can offer you some kind of payment over the maturity length of the assets, like every month, every year, till the asset matures, you're going to get some kind of return. This could be like a coupon payment. This could be a dividend for a stock market stock, right? But these are all different kind of payment that you can receive, and at the end, you can also receive the face value of the financial asset. So, in case of a bond, the argument is as follows. So if the borrower wants to borrow money, the borrower issues a piece of paper called bond, and the borrower promises that over the length of the maturity, over the length of the duration of you holding that bond, you're going to get some kind of interest payments every period, and at the end, when you sell that bond, you're going to get some face value. This is when you sell the bond before the bond matures. If you hold the bond till it matures, the borrower, the issuer, the borrower who was trying to borrow money from you is going to give the face value of that bond, right? Makes sense. So whatever happens, you're always going to get two part of return, right? One is this annual return, which you can call that an interest rate, and then you're going to get the face value. Now default risk is associated with the fear that either of them might not be paid. Either you are being paid the interest rate on a regular basis, but at the time of the maturity when you are supposed to pay back the face value, you don't pay back. Right? Now, when we are going to talk about the idea of default risk in this chapter and in the next couple of chapters, the example that I just provided, where the borrower fails to pay back the face value, is not that important, because most of the times when you are a bond issuer inside of an economy, more or less you pay back the face value. But then there are some other kind of debt which is usually accumulated by governments. Government sometimes fails to pay back the face value. Okay? And it's called a default risk for the government. So it has a name. It's called sovereign default risk, where countries can actually default. This is a very serious issue because right now I think Pakistan is in the verge of a default. Greece was on the verge of a default like a couple of years ago, where the amount of bond that Greek government issued to borrow money, the Greek government were not really in a position to pay back those face value. Are we all clear on that? They were continuing to pay the interest rates that on the loans that they borrowed from the general population and from the other countries. But at the end, there was a fear that they might not be able to pay back the huge amount of face value. Okay, so in either case, whenever there is some degree of fear that your part of it or full payment on your bonds are not going to be paid, it is called a default risk. And you can imagine that default risk is a very serious determinant of the interest rate. The liquidity is a very interesting concept when you think about bonds. And I want to also sort of get a feedback from you as to what you understand. So when you think about a bond, how do we look at the liquidity of a bond? Is it any way different from the liquidity of your medium of exchange?
The liquidity is basically just how quickly you can turn the bond into a medium of exchange.
Right, so they are basically connected, right? So the liquidity of a bond is very much similar to the liquidity of your medium of exchange, your money, right? So in some cases, your bond could be like a commodity money, where you are holding something that is valuable only when somebody else is willing to accept that from you. So your bond has the same kind of liquidity problem as your medium of exchange has, right? So the liquidity property of your bond refers to the same idea, same principle that we have learned in the context of our medium of exchange. So we want our bonds to be liquid, meaning that we want our bonds to be we should be able to sell our bonds pretty quickly, meaning that there has to be some kind of market where there is a demand for bonds and there is also a supply for bonds, meaning that the market for bonds are well behaved. If the market for the bonds are well behaved, it means that you can always sell your bonds and convert your bond into other kind of financial asset. So the liquidity property of a bond refers to the ability of your bond to be transformed into other kind of assets. And this liquidity property is very important. If your bonds are not liquid, you probably do not want to hold them. Right? Make sense? So second idea, we're going to explore that. The third one is very interesting, tax considerations. So let's just go into the main idea. So some bonds are taxed and some bonds are not. And they really affect your willingness to buy a bond. Why? Because your tax rate on bonds could be substantially high. Why? How do government tax your bond? Anyone?
Don't they tax it differently if it's an investment rather than if it's like for consumption?
Well, bonds are always for investment, and that's where the confusion starts from, right? Okay, so there are two aspects of tax issues that we need to really be aware of when we think about how taxes affect my bonds. One of them is discussed extensively in this chapter, the other one will be discussed later on. So imagine how government imposes tax on your bonds. It is very easy for the government to impose tax on your milk, right? You go to the Walmart, you buy a milk and you pay a sales tax and it's done, right? Are we all clear on that? How do government tax on your bonds? One tax could be that when you buy a bond in the E-Trade or wherever, the government charges you some kind of transaction fee, right? The government charges you a fee just like you are buying a can of milk. Make sense? That tax is very, very minimum. Sometimes, depending on, I think, state level considerations, sometimes depending on country level considerations, you don't really pay that tax. What is substantial is the other kind of tax, called a capital gain tax. How many of you are familiar with that? We're going to come back to capital gain tax big time. So, capital gain tax refers to the amount of tax that you pay when your financial assets value appreciates. And you pay this tax on the appreciated value of your assets. So let's say you buy a bond for $100. After a year, the value of the bond becomes $200. So the government will treat this appreciation of the value of the bond, which is $100, and charge you a tax on that. And the tax is like 40%, very high. Okay? So you can see that there is a direct disincentive, of not holding tax if you are required to pay a very high capital gain tax on your bonds. Same thing is true for your stocks, same thing is true for any kind of financial assets. So that's tax number 2, capital gain tax. The government also treats the interest rate that you are being paid, or the dividends that you receive from a stock, as some kind of accrual income, which is a kind of income that is not from your primary income source or primary source. I mean, it's very difficult to define that in this context. We are going to do that later on. According to government, if you have some additional sources of income, that income is always taxed at a higher rate. So if you work for the government or have a job, the amount of tax that you pay, which is called wage tax or some kind of income tax, is much lower than if you earn some interest rate from your bonds. So there are a couple of layers of taxes that you pay on a certain bond. As it turns out, some of the bonds are not taxed at all. Can anyone give me an example of what kind of bonds? The example of municipal bonds, which is usually issued by state level government or local level government, for the same set of purpose, by the way. So a treasury bill is issued by the federal government of USA. The municipal bonds are issued by the state government of a certain state. Sometimes there are cases where certain cities can also issue bonds, like city bonds. You probably have not seen that, but there are parts of Arkansas where the local government issues bond. They are very popular. Why would a local government issue a bond? Okay. The most common reason why poor states like Arkansas, Georgia, Missouri, local level government issues bond is because they don't have money. They don't have enough tax revenue that they can use to carry out expenditure purpose. So they issue bonds as well. These are tax deductible. You don't pay any tax of the higher interest rate on the most risky assets, on the lowest interest rate offered by the bond that has a tax treatment. Okay. Now let us start talking about the three factors that we are going to look at today. One is the idea of default risk. The other one is this idea of liquidity, and the third one is this idea of tax treatment. So default risk, as I mentioned, some definitions are critical for your exam. This is one of those. The definition of default risk will be in your exam. So default risk is the probability that the issuer of a bond is unable or unwilling. Unable and unwilling. These are very interesting. So unable, we understand. Sometimes you run into financial difficulty and you do not, and you cannot really pay back the bonds. When would you be unwilling to make interest payments or pay off the face value? Anyone? Do we understand about the issue of unwillingness? Do we know about any example where government was really unwilling or bond issuers were unwilling to pay back the interest rate or the face value? There are plenty of examples. Argentina in the 1980s once defaulted on their bonds. And the government of Argentina really did that intentionally. And that really confuses a lot of people when they look at the Argentina example. And some of you probably have or will take a look at courses that look at countries like Argentina or Russia. Russia is another example where Russian government defaulted on the interest rates that they were on the bonds that they were issuing. So why would a government, or to put it in a more microstructure, why would a firm be unwilling to pay back the loans or pay back the interest rate? There could be several examples. One thing is that the company is not a good one. The company issued those bonds just to scoop up the money from the financial market and they want to leave. So it could be that they're defaulting because they are escaping. Right? For a country like USA, this is highly illegal. And if you willingly default on your bonds, you could face so harsh penalty that you probably would not think about doing it twice. But then there are other countries, a lot of countries, including mine, where this kind of capital flight, it's called capital flight, where money gets out of the country, company gets shut down and they never pay back. Are we all clear on that? Where this capital flight is a very serious issue. Where every now and then, anyone familiar with George Soros? Anyone? Yeah, one of the richest guy, blah, 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 a Democrat, whatever. He once created a financial collapse in the UK foreign exchange market by doing exactly very similar things. He created these dummy companies that were, taking a lot of loans from that market, and then he just said that I'm not going to pay. And he's still in business, and he's one of the richest person in the world. So this is very interesting. So the idea of unwillingness is kind of serious in our real life, but in our course, default risk is either a willingness to unwillingness or unableness. If you are unable, it's obvious. If you're unwilling, you're also facing a default risk. When we talk about default risk, we also use a term, very, very important term called risk premium. So what is risk premium? Risk premium is the spread. Spread means difference between the interest rate on bonds with default risk and the interest rate on the same maturity treasury bonds. Okay? So when you think about the risk premium of let's say 6-month maturity bond, it is going to be equal to the interest rate on the bonds. So this is like the interest rate on, so this is the real interest rate on the bond, minus real interest rate on the treasury bill. It's called TB. So that's the spread. Now the risk, so the risk premium is a quantitative measurement of how you perceive or look at how risky a certain financial asset is. Now one could argue, and this is already evident in this main calculation, is that the idea of risk is a relative one, because everything is risky in the financial market. So rather than looking at riskiness of each individual financial assets, we want to create a relative measurement of their riskiness, and risk premium exactly gives you that. Risk premium compares the riskiness of an asset, on the basis of a asset which is considered to be riskless. So the higher interest rate you pay on an asset compared to a riskless asset such as the treasury bill is a measurement of your risk premium. Okay? So before we look at how the risk premium is calculated, we should understand two things about risk premium. If the risk premium goes up, if this calculation goes up, what can we say about the riskiness of the asset? This sounds like a trivial question. It is not a trivial question. Let me repeat the question again. Let's say the risk premium of an asset is going down. What do? In this case, let's say the risk premium is going up. The interest rate that you are earning from a risky bond compared to the interest rate that you could have earned from a treasury bond, the spread is going up. What do?
Depends on your risk averseness.
Very good. Very good answer. Right? So the answer is that we don't know. Right? So risk premium is sort of just one piece of the puzzle that we have to solve before we make a decision about what financial assets we need to buy and what not to buy. We understand when the risk premium goes up that a certain asset is becoming more risky compared to our treasury bills. What does that even mean? So what? If I am a very risky person, a rise in the risk premium probably is an incentive for me to buy these risky assets. If on the other hand I am not a risk lover, I am a risk averse person, for me a rise in risk premium means that I am going to buy these assets less than other assets with a lower amount of risk, right? So it just depends on what kind of person you are. So different people look at risk premium and make decisions on a fundamentally different way. Okay? Now let's look at how the risk premium is calculated. And this is a very, very interesting way of looking at the calculation of risk premium. We are going to start with a market equilibrium situation in the financial market, and then some exogenous shock is going to be given to the market that is going to change the nature of our demand or our supply for financial assets in this market, and that at the end will allow us to calculate risk premium. So let's go step by step and try to understand what information risk premium number gives us. So we are starting with step 1. So originally the market was in equilibrium with the blue lines, right? Okay. 2 assets, 2 markets. This is the market for a corporate bond. This is the market for a treasury bill. Our original assumption is that both of them are in equilibrium. The equilibrium price for bonds is P1C. The equilibrium price of treasury bill is P1T. Although the way the graphs are drawn, it seems like P1C and P1T are identical. They don't have to be. Are we all clear on that? We are just going to start with the idea that these 2 markets are in equilibrium. And suddenly there is an increase in default risk. How can that even happen? How can suddenly the default risk go up? of certain assets or whatever. So before we look at do that, I want you to guys to think about how can there be an increase in default risk. What does it even mean? Anyone? What does that mean? How can the default risk of a bond suddenly go up?
If you're in a period of crisis, or recession.
Right. So, okay. So, if I am in a period of crisis, does that mean that I am necessarily going to default?
No, but there is this.
Right. So, what is risk of default? Is that an actual event or is that a perceived event? Sorry? It's a perceived probability. It's an expectational term, right? So when we talk about a bond whose default risk have suddenly gone up, we are talking about changes in the expectations about that bond. So please remember this. And that could happen as a result of a variety of factors. Suddenly there could be a bad news that the company's managers have been fired, or there is a sort of scandal on the kinds of goods they produce. Anything, any factor that changes our expectation. That's the key word, right? So I want to write that word so that we remember it. I'm going to say that the increase or a decrease in default risk is all about expectations. So if that is true, and there is a increase in the default risk of our corporate bond, meaning that people are expecting that this bond is going to default, our demand for that bond is going to go down, which is indicated by a leftward shift of the demand for the corporate bonds. So that's the first piece of the puzzle. There is an increase in the default risk that reduces the demand for the more risky asset. In this case, it's a corporate bond. But one also has to understand that we are considering individuals who are considering a portfolio of choice about financial instruments. If they buy one asset less, they are going to buy another asset more. And this portfolio selection is based on their relative riskiness. That's why risk premium is such an important calculation. So I presume or I expect that the bond that I am holding, the corporate bond, is going to have a higher default of risk or risk of default, whatever that is. I'm going to buy those bonds less. So I have some extra money. With that extra money, I'm going to buy more of some other instrument. And in this case, in this simple vanilla kind of example, my demand for risk-less assets is going to go up. In a more realistic setup, you can randomly pick any two assets and observe the similar kind of relationship. So you can imagine the left market being left market being BAA market and the right market being a AAA market, right? So this is more riskier than the right one, right? That's the idea behind this very generic example. So as a result of an increase in the default risks by the more risky assets, two things are happening. Your demand for the more risky asset is going down and your demand for the less risky asset is going up. As a result, the new price on the more risky asset is lower and the price on the less risky asset is higher. So for the more risky bond market, the price on the bond is going to go down. That means the interest rate that you're offering on the bond is going to go up, right? Are we all clear on that? I think I went a little bit quick on that. Let me delete this. And I want to get back to this again. So if I1C is the original interest rate on my bond and I2C is the new interest rate after the change in expectations, what can we say about I1C and I2C? What kind of relationship do we know exists between I1C and I2C? Anyone? Is I1C greater than I2C or is I1C smaller than I2C? I1C is going to be smaller than, let's just, there are just too few space. Let's just draw that again. So we know that I1C is going to be lower than I2C, right? So my interest rate on the corporate bonds has to go up now. Why? I have asked this question several times, but I'm going to ask that again one more time so that we understand why an increase in the perceived riskiness of an asset also raises the interest rate on that asset. The reason is very simple, so let me reiterate on that again. So the reason why we know that the interest rate at the new market equilibrium is higher than the interest rate at the original market equilibrium, because since the relative riskiness of this asset has gone up, the only way people are going to buy this is if they get a higher return or a higher interest rate. That's why interest rate is going up. Right? Similarly, as the interest rate, as the price of the riskless bond is going up, we know that IT1, which is the interest rate in the original situation, is going to be higher than interest rate on the new interest rate at the new market equilibrium, right? Did I say it right? Yeah. So for our interest rate on the treasury bills, interest rate goes down. Interest rate on our risky assets, interest rate goes up. And that means that the risk premium, which is the spread of the interest rate between the risky asset and the riskless asset, is going up. Are we all clear on that? In this picture, the way risk premium is measured is the difference between IC2 and IT2, right? But you have to understand that I2T is actually smaller than IC2, right? This is the new interest rate on the risky asset. This is the new interest rate on the treasury bill. And this is smaller than this one. So please, yes.
So I1 is going to be more expensive than
I1 is going to be more expensive than I2. We really don't know at this point of time. And I think I mentioned that there is a misleading. Please do not get confused by the fact that P1C and P1T appears to be the same price. They don't have to be, right? If the market is in equilibrium, that doesn't mean that the interest rate, the price that you pay for a corporate bond is the same as the price that you pay for a treasury bill. They are all never the same, right? A corporate bond is usually more expensive than a treasury bill. That's a different story. Here, what we're trying to understand is how an increase in the riskiness, default risk of a bond really raises or increases the spread between the interest rate, therefore increases the risk premium. Okay? A lot of discussions, but the idea is that this is going to increase the spread, and the reason why we are calculating risk premium is that once we look at the term risk premium, it's a number that is calculated. We don't really have to go through this equilibrium analysis. When the risk premium is rising, we know this is exactly what is happening. So that's how I hope that you look at the numbers on risk premium. When the risk premium is going up, you are noticing that two things are happening. One is becoming riskier, the other one is becoming less and less risky. That's how the spread is, the difference is spreading. Okay. Some arbitrary list of bonds. I'm not interested in that. I have like 1 minute. In that, I just want to introduce the idea of liquidity. Because I will not be able to cover that. So liquidity is very important. Liquidity is the relative ease with which an asset can be converted into cash. Very simple idea. Very similar to a commodity money. It obviously depends on the selling cost of selling a bond. There could be transaction cost. The more transaction cost you have, the less liquid your bond is. The number of buyers and sellers in the bond market. That is a very important prerequisite. If you are buying a bond from a market where the participants are low, there is a very less chance that you will be able to sell it back. Are we all clear on that? So the size of the market is a good indication of how liquid your bonds are. Thank you very much.